Daniel Reed had always been cautious when it came to matters of the heart. At 30 years old, he had lived long enough to understand that the digital world of dating was as much about appearances as it was about truth. And more often than not, truth was the first casualty. A successful architect, Daniel's life appeared steady from the outside. His career was flourishing. His apartment overlooked the city skyline, and his circle of friends often reminded him he was too focused on work to let someone in. Yet beneath the exterior of calm and control, he carried the silent weight of longing, a yearning for a connection that went beyond fleeting conversations and shallow encounters. It was this restlessness that nudged him one night, scrolling through profiles with tired eyes, to pause at a face that seemed different from the rest. Her name was Claire, and her smile was disarming in its simplicity, not the posed perfection that most people crafted for a dating app. Her eyes held a knowing depth, as though they had seen and kept secrets no one else could guess. Daniel hesitated before swiping right. Something about her profile gave him pause. Her bio was brief, almost enigmatic. Looking for someone who values honesty above all. In a sea of empty platitudes, that line struck him harder than it should have. He told himself he wasn't going to read too much into it, but the truth was, he had always been sensitive to words that hinted at sincerity. When the notification lit up seconds later, "It's a match!" his heart skipped in a way he hadn't felt in years. The thrill was sharp, immediate, almost boyish, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt anticipation stir inside him. Their first conversation was effortless. Claire's responses weren't just witty but layered, as though every word was chosen to reveal just enough and hold something back at the same time. She asked questions that cut deeper than the usual small talk of likes and dislikes, steering toward his childhood, his values, his family. Daniel, not usually one to open up quickly, found himself offering glimpses of memories he rarely shared with strangers. It wasn't just that she listened. It was the way she made silence feel safe, a pause that drew him in instead of pushing him away. Every exchange left him with a sense of intrigue, like turning the pages of a book whose ending he desperately wanted to know. When she suggested they meet in person, Daniel didn't hesitate. There was a pull, undeniable and magnetic, something that made him believe this was more than just another digital distraction. He chose a quiet cafe, tucked away from the city's chaos, the kind of place where conversations could stretch unbroken. The day of the date, Daniel found himself unusually nervous. He had faced boardroom presentations, client negotiations worth millions, yet none of that compared to the quiet anxiety of waiting at that corner table, running his thumb over the rim of his coffee cup. And then she arrived. Claire was even more striking in person, but not in the conventional sense. Her beauty was understated, the kind that lingered the longer you looked. She wore a simple black dress, her hair falling casually over her shoulders, her eyes locking onto his with a confidence that made him forget the words he had prepared to say. The air seemed to shift the moment she sat down, and Daniel, who prided himself on reading people, found himself disarmed. He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more about him than she should, though he brushed it off as first-date nerves. Their conversation flowed easily, laughter threading through serious moments, stories trading back and forth as if they had known each other longer than a few weeks. Yet woven into her charm were odd moments, little pauses where her gaze lingered too long or her questions cut a little too sharp. At one point, she mentioned the neighborhood Daniel had grown up in, though he was certain he hadn't told her. When he asked how she knew, she brushed it off with a smile, saying she had an uncanny memory for details. The explanation seemed plausible enough, but unease prickled at the back of his mind. Still, Daniel found himself captivated. Every detail about Claire felt deliberate. The way she leaned forward when he spoke, how she mirrored his movements without seeming to try, how she slipped fragments of her own life into the conversation but never fully revealed the picture. There was a mystery about her that pulled him in deeper, against his better judgment. He told himself that sometimes the best connections were the ones that didn't make immediate sense, the ones that forced you to step outside your carefully drawn boundaries. As the evening stretched on, Daniel felt a strange duality settle over him. On one hand, He was drawn to Claire with an intensity he hadn't expected, the kind that stirred something raw and unguarded in him. On the other hand, there was a faint whisper in his instincts, warning him that she was not exactly who she appeared to be. He noticed the way she seemed to guide the conversation toward his family again and again, skirting around personal details of her own. Each time she would tilt her head, as though weighing his responses, as though searching for something hidden between his words. Daniel couldn't understand why it unsettled him, but he let it slide, convincing himself that maybe she was just genuinely curious. By the time they parted ways that night, the city lights flickering above them, Daniel felt both exhilarated and haunted. He replayed every moment in his head, every glance, every word, trying to decide if the electricity between them was real or if it was crafted. What lingered with him wasn't just her smile or the brush of her hand as they said goodbye. It was the strange sensation that this meeting was not the beginning of something new, but the unearthing of something old, something that had been waiting for him all along, hidden just beneath the surface of his carefully built life. Daniel woke the next morning with an odd mix of anticipation and unease still lingering from his first date with Claire. He had replayed the night countless times while lying awake, every detail amplified in the quiet of his apartment. It wasn't like him to obsess over someone he had just met. Normally, he kept people at arm's length until he was certain of their intentions. But with Claire, there had been something undeniable, something that bypassed his usual defenses and made him feel both exposed and strangely alive. He told himself that the strange comments she had made were just quirks of her personality, harmless slips of conversation, but deep down, he knew they carried weight. He just couldn't put his finger on why. Claire messaged him early that day, her words casual yet somehow charged with intimacy. "I had a great time last night. Dinner next time? Somewhere quieter, just us." Daniel read the message more than once, analyzing the phrasing. There was something deliberate in the way she emphasized "just us," as though she was subtly steering their connection into deeper waters. He replied quickly, masking his overthinking with a simple agreement. They settled on a restaurant tucked away on the city's edge, known for its discreet atmosphere and candlelit charm. By evening, Daniel found himself standing outside the restaurant, his nerves sharper than before. This wasn't just another date. It felt heavier, as though unseen currents were pulling him into something far more complex than romance. Claire greeted him with that same calm confidence, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that seemed almost rehearsed. She wore a dark red dress this time, understated yet striking, and the faintest trace of perfume clung to her presence, enough to make the air between them seem electric. From the start, the conversation took a different shape than their first encounter. Claire was more probing, her questions layered with an intensity that went beyond casual curiosity. She asked about his childhood again, not in a surface-level way, but pressing for details about his parents, his upbringing, the house he grew up in. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, sipping his drink, feeling the invisible weight of her attention pressing on him. It wasn't that he didn't want to share. It was that she seemed to know when he wasn't telling the full story, her silence coaxing him to fill in the gaps. At one point, Claire leaned in, lowering her voice as though they were sharing a secret. "You must have been very close to your father," she said, her eyes locked on his, her words more a statement than a question. Daniel froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't spoken about his father to her, or to anyone, in years. His father had left when Daniel was young, a wound that had never fully healed. He forced a smile, deflecting, but Claire didn't look convinced. Instead, she shifted the topic with uncanny ease, as though she had only wanted to gauge his reaction. The rest of the dinner was an intricate dance of charm and tension. Daniel couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. Her laughter was intoxicating, her presence magnetic. But beneath it all was a dissonance that he couldn't shake. She knew too much, or perhaps she was guessing too well, and it unsettled him in a way that gnawed at his composure. By the time dessert arrived, Daniel felt as though he was both revealing himself and being studied, his life dissected under her gaze without his consent. walking her to her car afterward. He tried to regain control of the situation, to convince himself that this was just the intensity of new attraction, nothing more. But when Claire turned to him, her expression softened yet unreadable. She whispered something that froze him where he stood. "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone in your family." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The words hung in the night air, unsettling and loaded with implication. Before he could press her for clarity, she smiled faintly, kissed him lightly on the cheek, and slipped into her car, leaving him standing in the parking lot with his heart pounding. As the taillights disappeared into the darkness, Daniel was left with a single thought he couldn't shake. This woman hadn't come into his life by chance. She was connected to something far deeper, something tied to the very secrets his family had buried long ago. Daniel spent the following days in a haze, caught between fascination and suspicion. He found himself checking his phone constantly, half hoping for a message from Claire, half dreading what it might contain. Her parting words lingered in his head like a whisper he couldn't silence. "Someone in your family." The line repeated itself over and over, scratching at the walls of his mind until he could no longer dismiss it as a flirty remark. It felt deliberate, like a breadcrumb dropped to lead him somewhere he hadn't chosen to go. When Claire finally texted him again, "Coffee? Tomorrow. There's something I'd like to talk about." Daniel's chest tightened. He told himself he should ignore it, that walking away now would be the rational choice. But reason had little sway over the storm building inside him. He needed answers. He needed to understand why she seemed to know him in ways she shouldn't. So he agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, far less polished than their previous venues. The smell of roasted beans and worn leather filled the air, the dim lighting adding to the intimacy of the space. Claire was already seated when Daniel arrived, her posture calm, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup as though she had been waiting for him longer than she admitted. Her eyes followed him the moment he walked in, her gaze steady, unwavering, almost predatory in its intensity. From the first sip of coffee, Daniel realized this conversation would not be like the others. Claire's charm was still there, but muted, replaced by a seriousness that made the air heavy. She asked about his childhood home again, this time more directly, almost pressing him to recall exact details, the street, the neighbors, the layout of the house. Daniel's nerves flared. "Why does that matter to you?" he asked, trying to inject a casual tone but failing to mask the edge in his voice. Claire leaned back slightly, studying him as if weighing whether to speak. Finally, she said, "Because sometimes the past explains more than the present ever could." Her voice was calm, but the words cut deep, cryptic enough to stir something sharp in Daniel's chest. He wanted to demand clarity, but her composure disarmed him. She spoke in riddles, each one pulling him closer instead of pushing him away. As the conversation stretched, subtle cracks began to appear in the story she presented of herself. Details shifted, timelines blurred. At one point, Daniel noticed she avoided talking about her own family entirely, deflecting with practiced ease. But whenever the subject of his parents came up, her interest sharpened, her questions precise, as though she was trying to confirm things she already suspected. The realization unsettled him. Claire wasn't here to get to know him. She was here to uncover something. By the time they left the cafe, Daniel's mind was racing. Walking alongside her down the street, he found himself torn between desire and doubt. She reached out, slipping her hand into his, her grip firm, grounding, but the gesture only heightened his confusion. There was warmth in her touch, but also control, as if she was steering him somewhere he couldn't yet see. At the corner, under the glow of a flickering street lamp, Claire stopped. She turned to him, her expression softer than it had been all evening, but her eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "There are things you don't know about your family, Daniel," she said quietly, almost tenderly. "Things they never told you. Maybe it's time you found out." Before he could respond, before he could gather the flood of questions rising in his throat, she kissed him. It wasn't the shy brush of their first parting. It was firm, deliberate, a kiss that left him both breathless and unsettled. And then, just like before, she pulled away with that faint, knowing smile and disappeared into the night, leaving Daniel standing alone with his pulse thundering in his ears. As he walked back to his apartment, her words haunted him. His family had always been a quiet subject, tucked neatly away into boxes of half-truths and unspoken history. But now, those sealed boxes rattled, threatening to burst open. He couldn't decide if Claire was a key to answers he had long avoided, or a danger dragging him into something far darker than he was prepared for. Either way, he knew one thing with certainty. His life had shifted, and there was no turning back to the safety of not knowing. Daniel's sleep became restless after that night, broken by fragments of dreams that felt more like warnings than figments of his imagination. He woke in the early hours, drenched in sweat, his mind replaying Claire's words over and over. "There are things you don't know about your family." It was as though her voice had embedded itself in the back of his skull, demanding to be heard even when he longed for silence. Every time he thought of her, he felt torn, half consumed by attraction, half poisoned by suspicion. He tried to push it aside by burying himself in work. Drafts piled on his desk, models of half-finished projects littered his studio, but even in the quiet hum of his professional life, Claire's shadow followed him. He found himself distracted in meetings, staring at his phone, hoping for another message from her while simultaneously dreading what it might reveal. It was as if she had wrapped invisible strings around him, pulling tighter with each interaction. When her next message arrived, "Come for a walk with me. There's something you should see." Daniel's chest tightened. He almost said no, almost threw his phone aside and vowed to cut her out completely. But curiosity had already sunk its claws too deep. He replied with a simple when, knowing full well he was surrendering to a path he didn't understand. The following evening, Claire led him through a quieter part of the city, far from the polished skyline he called home. The streets grew narrower, the buildings older, their facades whispering stories of forgotten decades. She walked with purpose, her heels striking the pavement with confidence, not once checking if he was keeping up. Daniel felt the odd sensation of being guided, like she knew exactly where this path would end while he stumbled in the dark. They stopped outside a worn-down townhouse, its paint peeling, its windows clouded with dust. Daniel frowned, unfamiliar with the area, and turned to her for explanation. Claire's gaze lingered on the house, her expression unreadable. "Doesn't this feel familiar?" she asked softly, almost to herself. Daniel shook his head, his confusion deepening. But there was something about the house that stirred unease in his gut, a faint tug of memory he couldn't place. She led him closer, her hand brushing against his arm as though to steady him. "This place, it's connected to your family," she whispered. Daniel's heart lurched, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to demand answers, to force her to explain what she meant. But something in her tone, calm, assured, almost reverent, made his throat tighten. As they stood in front of the house, the evening air heavy around them, Claire turned to him fully. "Your parents didn't tell you everything," she said, her eyes holding his with unsettling certainty. "There are secrets buried here, truths they kept hidden to protect themselves. And you," Daniel staggered back a step, his chest tightening. He had lived his whole life with the quiet knowledge that his family history had holes, memories his mother never spoke of, questions about his father that were always deflected with vague explanations. But hearing it from Claire, a woman who seemed to know more about him than she had any right to, made the silence of his childhood suddenly deafening. The moment stretched, tense and raw. The street was quiet except for the hum of a distant car engine, and Daniel felt the world tilt as though the ground beneath him wasn't as steady as he thought. Claire reached for his hand, her touch both grounding and terrifying. "Daniel," she murmured, "you've been living in the shadow of lies. Maybe it's time you face the truth." Daniel swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his voice caught somewhere between denial and demand. His instincts screamed at him to pull away, to run. but his heart clenched with the fear that walking away would mean never uncovering what had been hidden from him all along. For the first time in years, he felt like a child again, standing in the dark, searching for answers in the silence of people who refused to tell him the whole story. Daniel couldn't escape the weight of that night by the old townhouse. Even as he sat alone in his apartment, the image of its crumbling walls and Claire's unwavering eyes lingered, refusing to fade. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hoping the burn would silence the storm inside his chest. But instead it only sharpened his thoughts. The puzzle pieces of his past, ones he had carefully ignored, suddenly demanded to be fit together. His father's abrupt departure, his mother's clipped answers, the unspoken tension at family gatherings, all of it rushed back with alarming clarity. For years, Daniel had accepted half-truths because they were easier than prying open wounds no one wanted to talk about. Now, with Claire's words echoing in his head, ignorance no longer felt like an option. The following days turned into a quiet torment. He avoided calling his mother, though he wanted nothing more than to confront her. Instead, he obsessed over the townhouse. He replayed the walk with Claire, the way she said, "Doesn't this feel familiar?" as if daring him to remember something he couldn't. It gnawed at him until he finally gave in. One evening, after work, Daniel drove back to that part of the city, parking across the street from the house. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the building as though it might reveal its secrets on its own. The place looked abandoned, its windows blind with dust, the door weathered and cracked. And yet, as Daniel sat there, he couldn't shake the strange sensation that the house was watching him, holding its silence like a weapon. He forced himself out of the car, each step across the street feeling heavier than the last. Standing at the door, his hand hovering over the knob, his breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what he expected to find, an empty shell of a house or something much darker. The door gave way with a groan and he stepped inside. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by his intrusion, the faint smell of mildew wrapping around him. The interior was stripped bare, but the shadows seemed to cling to the walls, as though the house itself remembered more than it should. He wandered through the rooms, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, until he reached the living room. There, on the far wall, faint outlines of picture frames marked the faded wallpaper. His stomach twisted. Someone had once called this place home. As he traced the rectangular outlines with his fingers, flashes of memory surged unexpectedly. An image of his father's hand gripping his as a child. Laughter echoing in a room that looked eerily like this one. A woman's voice calling his name from somewhere beyond. Daniel stumbled back, his chest tightening, his head swimming with fragments he hadn't realized were buried. This wasn't just any house. He had been here before. The realization sent a chill through him so profound that he almost ran. But before he could leave, he noticed something strange. A small wooden box tucked into a corner, half hidden beneath a collapsed shelf. Dust covered its surface, but its presence felt deliberate, as though it had been waiting. With trembling hands, Daniel pulled it free, his heart hammering. Inside, he found a stack of yellowed letters tied with string, each envelope worn and fragile. The handwriting on them was unmistakable. His father's. He didn't open them there. The weight of discovery pressed too heavily on his chest, and the silence of the house grew suffocating. Clutching the box, Daniel hurried out, locking the door behind him even though it hadn't been locked to begin with. Back in his car, he sat with the box on his lap, staring at it as though it might burn him. His father's words, sealed away for years, were suddenly within reach. That night, in the solitude of his apartment, Daniel untied the string with unsteady fingers. He unfolded the first letter, his eyes scanning the faded ink, and with every sentence, the foundation of his life began to crack. His father hadn't left for the reasons his mother had told him. There were betrayals, buried ties, and a truth so entangled in secrecy that Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. His hands shook as he read, but he couldn't stop. Every word pulled him deeper, confirming what Claire had hinted at all along. His family was not what he thought it was, and somewhere in the middle of the revelation, a darker realization dawned. Claire hadn't stumbled into his life by chance. She knew, she had always known. She had been leading him here step by step, until the truth clawed its way out of the shadows. Daniel sat surrounded by the scattered letters, his apartment dim except for the lamp casting a pale glow across the table. Each page tore away another layer of his past, each sentence a blade carving into the fragile narrative he had carried his entire life. His father hadn't been the careless man who abandoned his family, as his mother had always implied. No, he had been driven out, forced into silence by choices that cut deeper than Daniel could have imagined. The letters spoke of betrayal, not just between his parents but within the family itself, deals made in secret, loyalties broken, and truths buried to protect reputations. What unsettled Daniel most was the recurring mention of names he didn't recognize, strangers intertwined with his bloodline in ways that blurred the line between family and foe. Claire's role was undeniable now. Every step, every conversation, every cryptic word, she had been maneuvering him toward this discovery. He couldn't decide if she was a messenger or a manipulator, if her presence in his life was a cruel trick or a necessary evil. The thought of her sent conflicting waves through him, longing and anger, trust and betrayal. He wanted to confront her, demand to know why she had chosen him, why she had torn open wounds he hadn't asked to face. When he finally saw her again, it wasn't planned. She appeared outside his building late one evening, her figure sharp against the glow of the streetlights, as though she had known he would be unable to resist reaching out. Daniel's fists clenched the moment their eyes met. "You knew," he said, his voice thick with accusation. "All along you knew." Claire didn't deny it. She stepped closer, her expression calm, but her eyes glinting with something heavier than satisfaction. "I knew pieces," she admitted softly, "but you needed to find the rest yourself. Would you have believed me if I told you outright? Or would you have buried the truth like your family did?" Her words stung because they carried truth. He hated her for it. He hated the way she forced him to look at the cracks in his family's story, the way she made him confront the lies that had shaped him. Yet beneath that anger was something more dangerous, a clarity that whispered she wasn't his enemy. She had simply lit the fire that now consumed everything he thought he knew. The days that followed became a blur of confrontation and unraveling. Daniel went to his mother, letters in hand, demanding explanations. Her silence shattered under the weight of what he already knew, her defenses crumbling as tears spilled truths she had spent decades hiding. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. The family Daniel thought he had was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, and standing in the wreckage of it all, he understood why Claire had said he reminded her of someone she once knew. Blood had tied his life to hers long before Tinder ever matched them. The truth, however, didn't offer peace. It offered rage. Rage at his mother for her lies, rage at his father for his silence, rage at Claire for pulling him into a storm he hadn't asked for. But beneath the rage came resolve, cold and steady. Secrets had stolen his childhood, stolen the truth of who he was meant to be. Now those who had played him like a pawn would face the consequences. Daniel's revenge wasn't immediate. It was calculated. He sifted through every letter, every detail, piecing together the betrayals that had defined his family. He reached out to people named in the letters, uncovering alliances and scandals that had been carefully hidden. Slowly, methodically, he began turning the very secrets meant to be buried into weapons, and through it all, Claire lingered. Sometimes beside him, sometimes just beyond reach, always watching as though she had ignited something in him she knew would grow. Whether she was an ally or a villain no longer mattered. What mattered was that Daniel Reed was no longer the man who had swiped right in search of companionship. He was something else now, sharper, colder, driven by a purpose forged from betrayal. The Tinder date that had started with laughter and chemistry had unraveled into a revelation of blood and deceit. And from its ashes, Daniel had found not love, but something far more enduring. The ruthless determination to ensure those who deceived him would finally pay the price for the life they had stolen.